Welcome.
Welcome. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this session, which is titled NC Legislature 101, Advocating with Compassion. This information has been presented as a webinar in the past in partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund to prepare folks to participate in public policy advocacy. And since we're unable to lobby as we typically would because of the coronavirus pandemic currently, we have updated and included some additional information in this presentation regarding what it means to advocate with compassion in these unprecedented times. So this material was originally developed by Veronica Butcher, whom NCIPL has been working with the past few years as our expert advocacy consultant. And we're grateful that we are able to continue to benefit from her wisdom in so many ways, including by being able to revamp this presentation and present it to you all today. If you're interested in working with or knowing more about Veronica, you can also find her through her consulting firm, Harmonizing Strategies. And she also works with Mothers and Others for Clean Air, which is a great organization. If you're not familiar with them, they're a good one to check out. Today, however, our presenters will include myself. My name is Sarah Ogletree. I am the program coordinator at North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light. I'm the primary point of contact for congregations. So I'm actually really glad that we had this moment to kind of just share our names and our locations in the state and what brings us to this call. I work with congregations across the state, and I would love to work with all of you on these issues and others. So please feel free to contact me. My email is programs@ncipl.org. So I will be helping to lead this conversation in addition to our director, Susanna Tuttle, and our new Duke University policy intern, who we have just thrown into this. This is his second week, Brian. So I'm gonna just pass it over to Susanna really quick to let her introduce herself.
Thanks, Sarah. My name is Susanna Tuttle. For those of you that I haven't had a chance to meet yet, I'm looking forward to that, and welcome old friends. I have been in this position since 2011, so it's been a number of years, and advocating with compassion has become my place of passion in this work. I did not come in with a lot of experience in public policy, and now I just love it. It's what gets me up in the morning. I'm thrilled about it, and I'm thrilled to share our experiences with each of you and learn how we can work together and build the movement for climate justice across North Carolina, the Southeast, and the entire United States. So thanks for joining us today. I'm going to pass it over to Brian.
Thanks. My name is Brian Barnett. As Sarah said, I am the Duke University public policy intern at the Council of Churches right now, and I'm very excited to have the chance to join in on this webinar.
Great. Thanks so much. Yeah, so then we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so a bit about what we're going to cover today. As a citizen, you have a unique opportunity to help make a difference by becoming more involved in communicating with your elected officials, which I'm sure you all know, that's why you're here. And today we're going to answer a few kind of commonly asked questions. So those questions include, how does the North Carolina General Assembly work? I think that's a big one. Who holds the power? So who do we need to talk to? How does that work? What does it mean to advocate with compassion? And how can you put your faith into action in these ways? So we're going to dive in, but first I just want to say again, feel free to ask questions as they come up in the chat. Again, you can hover your cursor down at the bottom of the screen and you'll see that chat bubble. Let us know who you are, let us know that you're here. That's another thing that you can do in the chat is just introduce yourselves. Let us know where you live in the state, but do ask questions as they come up and we will get to them in a Q&A session following the end of our presentation. I also just want to let you know that we are recording this session, as Susanna said, and part of that is because we're really trying to build up resources that you can use again and again with your congregations. Now, this presentation, some of it is an evergreen material kind of presentation, policy information that we're always going to need. Some of it is very specific to this current context of coronavirus and what it means to advocate with compassion during a pandemic when we can't do in-person lobbying. But hopefully this recording can be helpful to you and your communities moving forward. And we have many recordings on our YouTube channel that you can check out with your congregations as well that deal with all kinds of different topics related to climate change and environmental issues. That said, let's dive into the presentation.
Thanks, Sarah. So welcome again. And one of my favorite questions is, how many of you know who holds the power to represent you on the federal level? What about the state, locally? Feel free to use the chat box if you'd like to share your representatives' names. Many people do not know who represents them on each of these levels, and oftentimes find it very confusing to figure out who these people are. As a citizen of your city, county, state, and country, there are a lot of elected officials who represent you in different types of elected office. To find out who your members of the North Carolina General Assembly or Congress are, you can go to the General Assembly's website, which is ncleg.net, to find out. In the upper right-hand corner of that page, ncleg.net, there'll be a little place that, that you can click on that will give you the link to find out who represents you. And to find out who represents you locally, just Google for the City Council or County Commissioner's website in your area. So on the federal level, the legislative branch of government is the Congress, which is a bicameral government. This means members of Congress are divided into two chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Each state in the United States elects senators for staggered 6-year terms. The senators represent the entire state. For the House of Representatives, nationwide, the US is divided into 435 congressional districts, each with a population of about 710,000 individuals. Does anyone know how many districts we have in the state of North Carolina? I'll give it a moment for folks to drop the answers into the chat box. I can't see the chat box, so I don't know if there's any answers, but I'll give you the answer. It's 13 House districts. Each district elects a representative to the House of Representatives for a 2-year term. So each state in the nation has a different government structure and cycle, but they all have the same 3 branches of government, which mirror the federal government: executive, judicial, and legislative branches. Today, our focus will be on the North Carolina legislative branch of government. Again, I'm pleased to welcome Brian Barnett to our team as a Duke University Public Policy Fellow with the North Carolina Council of Churches. Brian, tell us more about North Carolina's General Assembly.
Thanks. North Carolina's government is divided as of 2020. So this is really about who holds the power, both in the legislative process, but also in other parts of government. Currently, the Republican Party holds power in the North Carolina General Assembly, which is commonly referred to as the Legislature. They have majorities in both the House of Representatives and in the Senate. The Speaker of the House is Tim Moore, and the President pro tempore of the Senate is Phil Berger, and they are both Republicans. However, the Democratic Party currently holds the highest office in the executive branch, with Governor Roy Cooper, who is a Democrat. The Lieutenant Governor is Dan Forrest, and he is a Republican. So let's talk a little bit about how the North Carolina General Assembly works. The purpose of the legislature is to create and change the laws of North Carolina, as well as to provide a budget for the state government operations. In North Carolina, we have a bicameral legislature as well, just like Congress on the federal level, which means legislators are divided into the 2 chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Legislative sessions are 2 years long and include a long and short session, which we'll detail a little bit later in this presentation. Legislators are elected for 2-year terms, and elections are held every 2 years. That's both representatives and senators in the state of North Carolina have 2-year terms. In 2018, all of the seats of the North Carolina General Assembly were up for election, and the Republican Party maintained enough seats in the legislature to have a majority in both chambers, but lost their veto-proof supermajority. A supermajority is a situation where a single party has 3/5 of the voting members of the legislature, and therefore they have the power to overturn any veto that might be issued by the governor. That situation is no longer the case in North Carolina. Now we're going to go back to Susanna to discuss the details of the two chambers.
Okay, unmute myself, that's good. So now we're gonna take a deeper dive into each chamber of the North Carolina legislature. Let's first talk about the Senate. The president of the Senate is the Lieutenant Governor of North Carolina, but the Lieutenant Governor has very limited powers in the Senate and can only vote to break a tie. The President pro tem, Senator Phil Berger, as Brian mentioned, holds the most power in the Senate with control over appointments of members to standing committees and wields a heavy influence over bills. The Senate is generally considered the more powerful of the two chambers, even though it has fewer members. I can change that slide, there we go. The House is led by a speaker who holds powers similar to those of the Senate President pro tem. Each chamber, the Senate and the House, has its own set of committees and caucuses. A committee is part of the legislative process. Each chamber has standing committees. Their membership and leadership can change year to year, but their roles remain the same for the most part. Committee members are publicized, open to the public, and concerned citizens and interest groups are allowed to give testimony in committees. We will talk more about committees and their role later in the presentation. A caucus is a group of people with similar beliefs. For example, each political party has a caucus, and there are also ones based on shared interests, like the Sportsman or Agricultural Caucus. Caucuses are used to hash out differences behind closed doors and to get the groups to come to an agreement on bills. These meetings are not open to the public. So this is an overview of the legislative cycle, and as we discussed before, it lasts for a biennium, which is 2 years. The first part of the regular session, or what is more commonly referred to as the long session, occurs in years ending in an odd number. For example, next year in 2021, the cycle begins with the long session in January. During the legislative session, meetings are held Monday evenings and during the day on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Most legislators return to their districts on the weekend to work, meet with constituents, and spend time with family. There is no limit on the length of any session. The long session typically lasts for 6 months, and the short session typically lasts for 6 weeks. So let's take a closer look at the long session. The first part of the long session is the only time in the entire 2-year cycle when legislators can make a new law, repeal an existing law, or make changes to a current law. There are, of course, some ways around this. To get a bill introduced through the cycle, it must, 1, have a fiscal or budget impact, or be a recommendation by a legislative committee or commission, or it is a PCS, or a preferred committee substitute. This is when a committee votes to strip language of an existing bill and replace it with completely new language. If any of you were following the coal ash bill a number of years ago, this is what happened to create the bill, since they were in the middle of the 2-year cycle when the Dan River coal ash spill took place.
So now let's follow the progress of a hypothetical bill through the legislative process. A bill can begin its journey in either chamber, the House or the Senate, and once it has been filed, it is then formally introduced into a chamber. For our purposes, let's say that it is introduced in the Senate. It's then read into that chamber for the first reading, and then it will be referred to a committee. This is a formality and typically happens very quickly at the beginning of a day's session. Bills commonly move through more than one committee for approval. Sometimes this process takes months and sometimes only a few hours. Committees have great power over the legislative process. They can choose not to take up or consider bills that are referred to them. If a bill is not considered or does not pass a vote of the committee it was assigned to, then that bill is considered dead. If a bill does receive committee approval, it will return to the Senate floor for its second reading. If it passes, it will then have its final reading. After passing the third reading, the bill will be sent to the next chamber. For our purposes, we started in the Senate, so it would be sent to the House.
Once the bill passes out of the first chamber, either the House or the Senate, it has met a requirement called the crossover deadline. This is the date by which all bills that do not affect the budget must pass at least one of the two chambers in order to remain in consideration for the rest of the 2-year cycle. The crossover deadline only occurs during the long session. If a bill fails to meet the deadline, it is considered dead for the rest of the 2-year cycle. This is why the timing of advocacy and education efforts are so important. For our purposes, our bill has just passed from the Senate and is being introduced to the House.
The bill now has to go through the same process it went through in the previous chamber: committees, votes, and readings. If a bill undergoes major changes and looks very different to what was approved by the first chamber, it has to be sent to a conference committee to be hashed out. The conference committee is made of a handful of members from both chambers and is charged with resolving the differences between the two bills. Once a bill passes both houses and is signed by the governor, it is considered ratified. If the bill is a local law, it becomes law immediately. Otherwise, it is effective on the date outlined in the bill itself. After adjournment of the General Assembly, the governor has 30 days to act on a bill. If the governor vetoes a bill, it is returned to the General Assembly, where a vote of 3/5 of present and voting members can vote to override the veto. As you can see, the numerous deadlines from February to May of the long session are why you see such a frenzy of work and media reports at certain times of the year, when other times there is very little going on with the General Assembly. This also means that every 2 years, there is a very small window of opportunity to influence legislators and the outcome of legislation. This is why meeting with elected officials when they are home in their districts before the session is so important. One last note on the bills which make the crossover deadline that was mentioned earlier. If they do not pass if they do not pass before the General Assembly adjourns the long session, the bill is still considered alive and can be brought up during the short session. In between sessions, your legislator is at home in the district working at their regular job. Being a legislator is only a part-time job and pays very little. This is a great time to get to know them and educate them on the issues that you care the most about. We'll talk more about this a little later.
So finally, the last part of the North Carolina General Assembly cycle is the short session. The short session is held in even-numbered years and typically lasts 6 weeks. During the short session, legislators tweak the budget, making any changes prior to the fiscal year, starting on July 1st. They consider committee recommendations of bills, and they take up any bills that are alive because they met the crossover deadlines, but are not budget related. Again, there is an even shorter amount of time during even-numbered years, of course of which we're in right now, to influence legislators and impact legislation. This is why the work you do to advocate and educate your community, congregation, and elected officials outside the halls of the North Carolina General Assembly and in between sessions is so critically important.
All right, so All of that said, it has become increasingly clear that values-based messages and messengers provide new angles on the issues that are presented to the North Carolina General Assembly and other legislative houses. So they are able to lead with a nonpartisan and moral voice of hope. An example of values-based messaging would be currently as we consider policies related to climate change during the coronavirus pandemic. So right now, when speaking with legislators about climate change, we are talking about how values of health connect climate justice and the desire to address COVID responsibly. We know that people who live in polluted areas, oftentimes people of color, are at a much higher risk of contracting COVID and also of losing their lives to this disease. So by connecting the issues and highlighting our values, we are able to advocate more clearly and with more relevance during this time. All of that said, over the past few years, because of our desire to connect our values to our policy work, NCIPL has developed a long-term faith-based Advocating with Compassion campaign that uses values-based messaging. We are teaching and engaging citizens and clergy on how to find their unique faith voice and use it to advocate with compassion with their decision makers. We encourage citizens to build long-term relationships with their elected officials by starting an open dialogue and practicing active listening. That often means asking questions and listening intently before speaking to your own advocacy goals. A great time to do this, again, would even be when your legislators are at home in their district. Elected officials are then asked to share their vision and ideas and to explore ways that they can work to protect and support policies which increase energy efficiency, develop clean and renewable energy sources, encourage large-scale composting, and decrease carbon pollution. Citizens can then share their stories of success from their communities and their congregations and why they believe their faith tradition calls them to care for this world, to care for creation through the many policies that they are advocating for. All of you on this call who spoke to me earlier before we began our formal presentation, many of you named that you are a member of a congregation or on a creation care team, and that's part of why you're doing this work. That's the kind of stuff that you could share with your legislators. I'm sharing, and then of course, I'm sharing some of the specifics of how NCIPL has developed this pedagogy of advocating with compassion. But advocating with compassion is at the root of what originally brought the North Carolina Council of Churches together and is obviously a centerpiece in the core values of every person and program that has been a part of the council's work and leadership. My guess is it's a centerpiece of how you feel about the work that you're doing and why you're involved in these issues. Okay. So 2020 would have been our 6th annual Advocacy Day at the North Carolina General Assembly. Some of you maybe have attended our Advocacy Days in the past. If you have, we would love to know that. You could write that in the chat. But obviously, due to the implications of COVID-19, we are not able currently to travel across the state and gather in Raleigh to meet with our elected officials. But that doesn't prohibit any of us from reaching out to our representatives and continuing to build relationships with our decision makers. So in fact, this is a really important time to let them know that we are thinking of them and that all of the critical votes that they are taking to protect and support the citizens and economies of North Carolina mean something to us, that they matter. One way that NCIPL works to be strategic in our engagements with North Carolina General Assembly's members has been to determine strategic target areas. In the advocacy world, it is often called power mapping. So you can see kind of a power map on the slide here. These connections that are being made. And power mapping is the ways to identify who and what influences decision makers, what they're pulling from when they think about the decisions that they're making. As a faith-based initiative, we have the opportunity to review our legislators' faith tradition, what congregation they belong to, and if they have ever spoken publicly with a moral or religious voice about what they care about. NCIPL is also continuing to map our own congregational network to help determine which legislative districts we have a strong presence in, as well as whether or not legislative members' affiliated congregations tend to be more progressive, moderate, or conservative in relation to environmental issues. This power mapping strategy can help us better understand decision makers as people in communities themselves. They think about some examples, or help us to think about some examples of how to best build a relationship with someone. If you are trying to build a relationship, knowing where someone grew up, if they have children, if they love animals, hiking, gardening, sports, all of those things are a great way to connect on a personal level, which ultimately will help you build trust and interest for what you have to say and think about. Even if we find ourselves on opposite side of certain issues, we still need to treat each other with dignity and respect. And NCIPL aims to be a model of these examples of advocating with compassion. a fun little tidbit about learning something about your legislators or the people who represent you is that Senator Tillis loves dogs. So if you love dogs, you have something in common with him. I love dogs. Okay, all that said, what does it mean to advocate with compassion? It's basically just what it sounds like. It means approaching conversations with our elected officials with a sense of deep and authentic kindness, empathy, fairness, and an acknowledgement of shared humanity. When I think of compassion, particularly from the context of advocating from a place of faith or spirituality, I think about bringing my values into the room with me when I'm speaking to an elected official. Now, these are all values related to compassion, values of fairness, justice, love for neighbor, humility, and kindness, which really, for me, kindness differs from niceness because it's not just about being polite. It's about creating the space in the room for someone to be honest about who they are, where they are, what they need, and what their current challenges are. So being kind is a really important and deep value of creating that space and that opportunity for honesty. In other words, authentic compassion creates the opportunity for authentic relationships and authentic conversation. I also think of compassion as being a value of integrity. When we advocate with compassion, which is a shared value across religious traditions, this is a beautiful quote from the Dalai Lama, we are being honest about who we are and why we are advocating for the work that we are doing, work of sustainability, work of climate and environmental justice. We are showing up to advocate for the work that we are advocating for because of the love that we have for people, the love that we have for our home communities, for our ecosystems, for North Carolina, and for the world. Summed up in another way, advocating with compassion really is advocating with love. It's treating your conversation partners with love and letting your discussion be led by love. You might begin your conversation by talking about your deep love for the coastal community that you grew up in or that you live in today. You might talk about how you've been influenced and how that coastal community is impacting what you advocate for now. You might talk about your deep love for farmers. My husband is a farmer, so when I talk to my elected officials, I can talk about that and connect on agricultural issues. You may talk about your love for the mountains, where you live or where you go on vacation. I grew up in the mountains. I grew up west of Asheville. I know we have some folks from Asheville on the call. So I have a deep love for this ecosystem and this geography, and that's also a part of why I do this work. And you might talk just simply about your love for your family and your love for your neighborhood, because we can all connect on that. We can relate to each other when we speak from a place of love. And when we do this, we really do invite each other into realer and I think more transformative conversations. Yeah. So as a concerned citizen, your role really is to give voice and real life stories to public policy issues. You don't need to be an expert on numbers and facts because that's what professional lobbyists and state level advocacy groups are for. Their role is to provide detailed information and advise legislators, to help new legislators learn the ropes, to play the kind of political game, to find sponsors for bills. But your role is to give voice and breathe real life stories into these policy issues, to speak from your lived experience, to breathe love into the work, and to bring that policy to life. And now to Susanna.
Thanks, Sarah. So we have been reviewing the importance of building relationships with our local and state elected officials, and it's also critical that we build relationships with our representatives in Washington, D.C., and that they can hear our faithful voices. At the federal level, it is often best strategy to actually develop relationships with staff and legislative assistants. Because elected officials have to vote on so many different issues, it is often the young assistants that know the most about the details of any issue, and it is through their advice that a vote is either made for or against a bill. Building those personal relationships is key. Sharing stories, as Sarah was explaining, of family, school experiences, hobby interests, etc., is what helps to remind all of us about who legislative assistants are and who we are as people, to help us better understand where they are coming from and what kind of ideas and suggestions they may share with their decision makers that they work for. The bottom two photos on this slide are pictures of NCIPL leaders meeting with staff that we have developed relationships over the years, and the representatives, the years that the representatives that they work for have been in office. And one of my favorite is the photo in the bottom right corner. That's Reverend Steve Halstead, who traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with Senator Tillis's staff. And when we started talking about the Pope's encyclical, the staff member took the photo off of the wall of when the Pope addressed Congress. And both the staff member and Senator Tillis are both Catholic, of the Catholic faith. And he shared that it was really the highlight of his experience of working in Washington, D.C. And to have that shared moment, and you can see the smile on the face of both of them, that's a moment that they will remember forever. And I don't know how many times that picture gets taken off the wall and a snapshot gets taken of it with a member of a faith tradition that's there to advocate with compassion and on our values, but we had shared values there in that moment, and it was a really special time. The top picture shows a group of NCIPL volunteers participating in a virtual meeting with former senators in energy and environment staff. And we were able to set up that meeting from her office in Raleigh to connect with their office in DC, so that they didn't have to travel to DC, but could still have that direct engagement with the staff members and build those relationships. And obviously the ability to meet virtually is becoming increasingly important during this time of the pandemic. And we are here to help. Both Sarah and I would be more than willing to help schedule meetings for you in a virtual way, as you are willing and able, with members of your elected official in Washington, D.C., in your congressional districts and within the Senate's office. So it is just as critical to reach out to elected officials, as we said, when they are home working and campaigning in their districts. The goal is for individuals to invite your elected officials to see the good work you are doing in your communities and hear the stories of what our congregations are doing. For example, if a church is in the process of or has already completed an NCIPL energy audit, the members of the congregation have a great story to share with their elected officials. They can invite them to tour the church, see the changes, hear how much money the community has been able to save, what they've been able to do with the money now that they're not having to pay an increased utility bill, and how they're using it to support their ministries at the community level. And this is a great way to begin to develop a relationship with decision makers and get them to know you while you get to know them. And that's just as important. I think too often folks forget that when people run for office, they truly are there to represent you. And if we're not taking the time to do the outreach so that they can get to know us, how can they possibly represent us and what our values are if they don't know what they are, if we haven't told them and shown them? And an event like Blessing the Animals is something, a wonderful, joyous celebration. I hope we'll be able to do that in gatherings in the future. But that's an event, that's an example of an event that you can actually invite your representatives to anything that you're doing at the community level. If you just planted a community garden and you want them to come by, the truth is that elected officials love to be in community, and what we hear often is that they don't get the invitation enough. So I really encourage everyone to be thinking creatively about what and when and where they can invite their elected official to be in community with them.
Yes, so again, thanks, Susanna. Human beings are storytellers. Stories move us and are powerful tools to educate legislators. Stories are helpful to them because they can then use these stories to build support for the issues that they care about and that we care about, that we're advocating for. So we are currently in an election year. We are all very aware of that. And I have heard many elected officials, in addition to those who are campaigning, share stories they've heard from constituents. It's a memorable and powerful way to communicate and to advocate. I just can't even name how many times I've heard someone begin a speech by, somebody stopped me and told me a story about their son, or I met with a constituent and this is what they had to say. And folks, also sharing your story in print is just as powerful as sharing it in person. people are reached in different ways. And I love words. I love to write and to read. So different means of communication really do matter. Sharing your story in a virtual Zoom meeting, like we're doing right now, is also an option, something that you can do as well. The kinds of stories that you want to share also are the ones that have shaped you or have had a large influence on your life. So you can talk about the way that you or people you love have been impacted by legislation or the lack of legislation. You can share a story of a moment that you've witnessed that was powerful, or an insight that you gained from a particular interaction. I would encourage you to just go ahead and brainstorm some of those potential story or conversation starters. And as you're thinking about your story, also think about who you are. I shared that I grew up in the mountains of Western North Carolina. That's a part of who I am. I currently live in Lenore. That's also a part of who I am. I grew up a Baptist, and I've been a member of almost every Christian denomination. I'm a vastly ecumenical person. That's also a part of who I am. So where did you grow up? Where do you live now? How has your faith or spiritual tradition shaped you? Think about what you did for a living, or what you currently do for a living, what your hobbies are. If you get outside a lot, if you garden, if you hike, any of these things could help you form a short story that helps you to connect with others, and in this case, to your elected officials. Be sure also to name the people and places in your story. Name those folks who really had an impact on your life, or the people that you're bringing up. This helps to connect people to the issue as well. And another way that you can do this is through letters to the editor. So right now, the Faith Voice is really underutilizing letters to the editor in local and national newspapers as a tool to increase awareness about issues. So if you are someone like me who loves words, that is an opportunity for you to advocate, is to write letters to the editor, to tell your story in that way, and to have a wide audience. That's another thing that you can do. You can get those letters to the editor published. Please let us know if you write them. We would love to share them on our social media, on our Facebook and on our Twitter, and really amplify your voice. And also, if you are on social media, this is another opportunity for you to share your story. Yes. Lastly, please consider praying with your legislators if and when you have these meetings with them. Now, I really want to emphasize to only do this if this is authentic to who you are and your tradition or practice. If it is not an authentic part of your identity to pray, that is totally okay. And you may consider saying something like, "We're thinking of you," or just to offer thanks. That's also really, really helpful and important. But if prayer is something that you do and something that you are comfortable with, it can really impact a meeting. Lawmakers are used to talking about bills and legislation, and rightly so. But acknowledging the difficulties of the work and praying for them and other decision makers is a kind and I think really beautiful way to end a meeting. Susanna and I had the opportunity recently to virtually lobby with Senator Tillis's staff. And at the end of that meeting, we offered a prayer. It was just a phone call. It was a conference call. And we prayed with them on that call. And I think that they really, really appreciated it. Another way that we have offered prayer in this work is through the North Carolina Council of Churches annual prayer breakfast. The photos on this slide are of that event. Launched in 2018, the North Carolina Council of Churches 38-member governing board representing 18 denominations and approximately 6,200 congregations in North Carolina have gathered for breakfast at the North Carolina General Assembly cafeteria. Invitations have been extended to every member of the legislature. Turnout has been great. And we've been able to educate our representatives while also praying with our elected officials. And it's been something that people have really appreciated. So if that is something that is authentic to who you are, certainly bring that part of yourself into your advocacy meetings. And again, see, I'm reading, as you've noticed, and I didn't realize that there was another page. So here we go. Again, one more reminder is just to please start conversations with elected officials by talking about what they love and what you love. The response from faith leaders and legislators is almost always that they love this place. They love North Carolina. They love the mountains. They love the ocean. They love vacationing with their grandchildren, or picnicking with their family. They love their congregation. And there is so much that can bring us together by sharing what we love. So beginning that conversation based in love means will really move you to issues not of business, but of humanity. and ask those larger questions. It brings those larger questions of morality into the work, and that's so important. Ultimately, it is that lens of morality that overcomes despair, and we know that this is a moral movement, that climate justice, that environmental work, that creation care, these are moral causes, and that's kind of the space that we want to bring our legislators into. By returning to the core values of our hearts, we can find the creativity, strength, and vision to move beyond this powerful status quo and to create a true culture shift, which is really what we're all about, shifting us toward a more sustainable, just, and compassionate world. That's what we hope that advocacy can do. That's what we hope that the work of your congregations can do. Yeah, so now we're going to move to questions. And I have seen some really wonderful questions in the chat pop up, so thank you for those. And if you have any other questions now, we have over 10 minutes for questions. So thank you all for listening. And the first question, Susanna and Brian, really goes to you guys. So let me grab that question.
Okay. And I stopped sharing my screen. So if folks want to see the folks on the call, I'll spotlight whoever's well, actually, I'll just keep it in gallery view because I think it's nice to be able to see all of you at once. So if you're new to Zoom and you're still just seeing one big person talking, if you go to your upper right-hand corner, there'll be a little button you can push and you'll see gallery view, and then you'll see all of us on the call today to have more of a conversation.
Yes, thank you. So this first question comes from Maria, and it is, why is the Senate considered more powerful? Power in terms of what? Can you say a bit more?
Yes, that is a great question. And that goes not only at the state level, but at the federal level as well. And it's interesting because when you think about the number of districts and how many people you represent, when we think about how the breakdown is of our congressional districts in North Carolina, as we mentioned, there are 13 congressional districts that go to Washington, D.C., and we only have 2 senators, correct? So the power dynamics shift because the vote gets spread out, and that plays the same way in the General Assembly, is that because there's more of them in the House, that means that their individual vote is representing a smaller amount of folk. So you have to actually, we talked about committees and caucuses in particular, and unfortunately, because our political divide is so strong right now, the parties have practically become caucuses unto themselves. And so, as we know, that in North Carolina in the General Assembly, the House Democrats are organizing themselves so that they can get on the same page, doing a lot more caucusing within the party than even in traditional, which would have been more issue oriented, because they have to respond to the House Republicans. And in North Carolina, we have much more alignment across all of the House members. So you probably, if you're following some of the bills that have taken place over the course of the last couple of years, the House works really hard to write what would be considered to be a fairly decent bill. And then when it makes the crossover deadline and the House votes to put it into the other chamber, it gets to the Senate, and the Senate often just completely discounts what the House has written. And because the Senate, again, holds more power in the way that it does, because it represents, there's a smaller number of folk, but they represent more people, it counter levers the power making of decision. And so then the House often has to come back and respond and confirm whether they're going to actually support the Senate version of a bill or not. And it gets really, really tricky. So I don't know, Brian, if you have anything you want to bring in addition to that?
No, I think that just about covers it.
Yep. So we're talking a lot about voting right now and how important it is for everyone to vote, and how we need to be protecting our democracy. And when we're looking at what some of the most important races are, as far as understanding what our ballot looks like and helping people educate what their ballot looks like, first of all, they have to know who their representatives are, of course, and if they're up for re-election. And then if you only have a finite amount of time or capacity or energy to really get out and support a candidate of your choice, obviously NCIPL and the North Carolina Council of Churches is a 501c3 organization. So we are completely nonpartisan. We never endorse candidates. We are issue-based, issue-focused. And we can talk to different candidates about where they are on those issue priorities. But as individuals and members of congregations, you are more than willing and able, and myself as an individual, as an individual voter, can support candidates. And so there are really wonderful resources that I can help share through our partner organizations if you're looking to find out what some of the key races are right now in order to make sure that we have a balance of power and that we're electing officials on all scales that truly support the democratic process, that they're holding democracy as a key value for the United States at the local, state, and national level.
Great. Thank you, Susanna and Brian. Another question that we had, which I think is a really important one, also came from Maria. So thank you for your questions, Maria. And it's bringing up that she says that, she believes that all of us on this call we believe the Dalai Lama's quote this about shared values across religious traditions, but also that many of our elected officials who might proclaim Christianity as their faith don't seem to be living into compassion as their shared value. And it seems to be what they're harping on is this this kind of faith of terror or of war or fear is maybe what I would add is a faith of fear. And what I just want to add or offer in regards to that question, and Maria, let me know if I'm misunderstanding, but I just want to acknowledge that is a real challenge and that I hear you. And for me, I'm a Christian, and like I said earlier on the call, I grew up in the Baptist tradition. So, the Baptists as kids, we all learned the BIBLE song, and we talk a lot about the Bible. And I really do use scripture when I'm with people who are proclaiming Christianity as their faith tradition, who are really Bible believers. They really deeply love scripture, but I feel like we have some differences of opinions and we're not coming at it in the same way. And I point to Jesus as my kind of guiding light there, because that Jesus is important to them too. And love of neighbor and love of the least of these is just what I really talk about. We cannot love our neighbor without loving the water they drink and the ground in which their food is grown and the air that they breathe. And we cannot care for the least of these, care for people in poverty, people who've been marginalized or oppressed, without acting on climate change as well, as it impacts those folks in the most disproportionately in a negative way. So I use scripture with them, but I hear you, and I know that is a challenge, and it can be very frustrating. So also other points of contact or connection, if that feels hard, finding out where someone's from. I think that is a really relevant one. If you have a similar geographic location and a love for a place, you can start with love for place, or just love for community. But I absolutely hear you on that. I think we have some other questions as well.
And if I can just speak briefly to that as well, Sarah. So one of the things in the slide that we showed about the power mapping, one of the things that has been so critical for us, and Penny and I, who's on the call, have been in many offices together, where we are very clear that we are serving as faithful witnesses to their leadership, and that we will hold them accountable for their decisions that they're making. And we say that in a really loving way, but we mean it also. And so the power mapping structure of understanding where a decision maker comes from their religious perspective, I recognize, most of you might know that I'm a Unitarian Universalist. We don't have a lot of UUs in elected official roles. And so for me to go deep into my theology is not always ideal. And so we find other points of reference in which to build those relationships. By identifying, if someone's Episcopalian or Presbyterian or Methodist or Catholic or, whatever tradition they are, Part of what NCIPL is here to do is build out these relationships across our network so that we can identify the best messenger. And Sarah has been such a fabulous person to add to the staff because of her experience with scripture and the ability to actually go into different passages and talk that level of theology. And if she's not of the same tradition of the person you're having the conversation with, we never want to get into a confrontation with regards to who might believe what. And I want to just echo that one of the most powerful aspects of what we've been doing in the climate advocacy world is to be very, very clear that you don't really get a choice whether or not you get to believe in climate change. It's not a belief system, it's science. And so if we want to talk about beliefs, we're happy to talk about beliefs. We're the North Carolina Council of Churches, and we can talk about your beliefs all day long. And we've been able to go in and have deep connections about what they actually believe in and be able to hear some of their theological perspectives, and then identify the best people to come in and really have those deep level conversations from that perspective, the right people to have them. We are in those offices because we care about our communities and we care about the environment. We care about environmental justice. And so always bringing it back to that, and again, being able to be clear that when suffering occurs, that's not a matter of whether or not you believe that is happening. It is real, it is true. And so those kinds of resources and holding them accountable for the decisions that they make and the impacts it has on our communities is absolutely imperative and a priority of why we're in the office in the first place.
Great. So just a couple more. Yeah, bye, Penny. I saw that you had to leave. That's fine. Just a few statements really quick. Penny offered a great suggestion, which is if you have a meeting with an elected official, be it by Zoom or in person, maybe down the road or whatever it is, please, like, sending them a thank you card is a really good idea. So reaching out in that way, that just solidifies your relationship a little bit more, reminds them who you are, reminds them of that event. David also said that he has had experience in the past of inviting elected officials to events that support the issues that he's working on, and that's been helpful, and it's been it's worked. So that's a great backing up of that opportunity for advocacy. David also recommended a little book here. So as we're thinking about this kind of theological piece to all of this and bringing that moral voice, the book is, there it is. He's holding it up. It's called The Little Book of Biblical Justice by Chris Marshall, and it's less than 75 pages. So that might be a good book for a Sunday school class or some kind of event, a smaller group or book study to read. And there's lots of resources like that as well. So thank you, David, for highlighting that. And if that's a piece that folks are interested in digging more into, how can we buff up on our theology to be able to speak this language of morality, I want to have that conversation with you. So email me at programs@ncipl.org. I would love to have that conversation. And we actually offer a presentation that's strictly called Faithfully Responding to the Climate Crisis. And it's theology, climate change, science, and action opportunities. So I give those to congregations all over the state, and I can do that virtually. I'm giving one on Friday. And we also have presentations on climate change and human health, which I think, again, helps connect people to the work in a different way.
Yeah,
so,
thanks, Sarah. Yeah. I dropped
Uh-huh.
your email into the chat so everyone will have it. And I guess I'll just wrap up since we're almost at the top of the hour here, that ordinarily we would be at the General Assembly, as Sarah said this year. I invite you to join us next year. Hopefully we'll be able to do that in person. And between now and then, I really hope that we can identify some opportunities for each of you to do some virtual meetings. So I mentioned that we're happy to help you set those up, or just provide resources. As voters, you're allowed to set up all your own meetings, so that would be fantastic. And then in the past, I also have been doing, as I mentioned, our partner organizations. We work with the Southern Environmental Law Center, the North Carolina Conservation Network, North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association, Environmental Defense Fund, the Natural Resources Defense Council. We are an active member of the U.S. Climate Action Network. So we follow bills in relationship to our partners. And ordinarily what I would be doing right now in the short session is distributing out to NCIPL's network what all the bills that are still alive, where they're at. Any bills that didn't make the crossover deadline, we would have sent that out at the end of the long session so you can see what didn't move, what made it into the short session, and what is going to move, and how we can advocate for them, and whether we support or oppose them. So beginning next year, we will have an opportunity to do that. Sarah and I and all of us at the North Carolina Council of Churches, again, are really prioritizing the get out the vote work right now. And we do have a pledge that we're asking folks to take. We have committed to gathering 3,000, a minimum of 3,000 pledges to take the Faith Climate Voter Pledge. So we will send that. Since you all registered for this, we'll send that pledge if you haven't taken it already. And if we can triple the vote, if each of us make sure that we confirm that at least 2 additional people beyond ourselves are going to vote, that's going to be fantastic. And we're also going to be doing a lot of town halls over the course of this summer with the Council of Churches on the different issue areas. We partnered National Interfaith Power and Light partnered with Faith and Public Life, and we are launching a multi-issue faith voter guide, and NCIPL has committed to distributing 10,000 of those across North Carolina. So you will definitely receive a copy of those, and we hope you'll share them with all your friends and family and do that kind of relational organizing that congregations are the best at, because we have so many relationships and we're relationship people. So I again very much thank you for joining us today. I hope to stay in contact. For those of you that, again, I haven't met in person, let's develop a virtual relationship now, and we'll keep this going. So thanks so much and have a wonderful day.